actually privatized public functions. The ultimate public function is the war power, and we have now privatized that.
We economic hitmen have created the world's first truly global empire.
This is about corporations. And this is old-fashioned or refashioned corporate welfarism.
Why do we live in a world where everyone speaks about freedom and the benefits of that freedom accrue to fewer and fewer people as capital and power concentrates?
The people who are losing because their investments are wiped out and because their savings are wiped out are losing because they were part of a society that went down the wrong track.
Most societies have an elite tries to stay in power. And the ways they stay in power is not merely by controlling the means of production, to be Marxist, i.e. controlling the money, but by controlling the cognitive map, the way we think.
We teach our economics in a way that assumes this very neat, simplistic, almost psychopathic individual.
They're getting away with all kinds of legal thievery. People are beginning to get angry, but not nearly enough.
It's like a den of thieves. You know, it's one of the most, it's like Sodom and Gomorrah down there.
You should not assume because you don't have a background in economics or in law that these issues are somehow too complex for you. They're not complex at all. It's very simple. It's about power, and it's about democracy, and you understand that just as well as I do.
I don't think there's anything deeper than what's on the surface. I mean, intellectuals have to make it look complicated. That's part of their job.
Welcome back to Monday Live on Side with Andrew Terrell, who joins us now to talk about The Four Horsemen, which is a film of which the trailer you've just seen during our intermission. Andrew is a master's student in international political economy, and he will be hosting a screening of the film later this week. Isn't that right?
Yes, yes. Well, thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it. The film I first heard about several months ago, and then I attended a premiere in London, and when I watched it, I said, well, this is the sort of thing that Warwick students need to see, especially in our PACE department. So we've set up a screening of the film with the director that will be coming and having a Q&A here. The Four Horsemen, which is originally, as many of you probably know, a story from the Bible about Revelation and the coming of the apocalypse. Not the most sunny tale you can imagine. But the story is about, really in the Bible, about pestilence, war, disease. These have become the Four Horsemen. And what the director has done is sort of juxtapose that to what he, and I believe many other people, think are threats to really the greatest invention of the last century, which is the maturation of Western democratic society. And so he tries and takes 23 interviews of key public officials, chief economists from the IMF, the World Bank, senior people who have since retired, and many of which have been marginalized, and put those together to create a story and a narrative, which he does very, very well. And with this, he also brings some animations to take some of the more complex economic concepts and make them very, very simple, I think, to understand, which is one of the hardest things for a director and for a documentarian to do, I believe.
So, where would you see this film in the context of what's happening in the Eurozone right now?
Well, I think it's very pertinent. I mean, I'm surprised there haven't been more documentaries like this. I mean, of course, there have been quite a lot, actually. The financial crisis has been fodder for a number of documentarians and journalists.
That's
and
right.
they produced some really, really good ones, especially like PBS, Frontline, others who've done really good jobs at telling this story. But what they haven't done is taken these kind of core interviews and put together a narrative that I think describes not only the crisis, but I think sort of the thought processes and the sort of social relations that go on at an international level that form, I think, a particular elite class that makes these decisions. It's been touched on in other documentaries, but I don't think it's been expounded as well as it is here. And I think international political economists, as well as regular economists and political science students, need to understand the basis of social relations which all these institutions are formed out of. They're not just institutions with rules and regulations and they go out and they do this job based on these rules and regulations. They are a sum of the people, of their leaders, of their ideologies, of their educations. And, I mean, you see someone like Mario Draghi, the leader of the European Central Bank, as well as Ben Bernanke in the United States and several other central bankers. They all went to school together at MIT. I mean, that's going to engender a certain ideology, a certain level of action and reaction, a certain limitation on what they think is possible and what is probable and what is useful to occur with the whole policymakers and what they propose to policymakers. And I think it's important for people to understand.
So where and when will the film be shown, just so that the viewers out there can catch it?
Well, it will be this Wednesday, which I know flies in the face of a lot of undergrad exams, so my apologies. But I hope that many people will make it out. It's going to start at 6. We'll have a short introduction by the director, Ross Ashcroft, who will be down with his producer, Megan. And from there, we'll have the screening. And we're again going to have an academic panel afterwards. Consists of a world-renowned academic, and his home is here at work, Jano Schulte, as well as one of the field's experts in international political economy, Matthew Watson, as well as Lena Rethel, who just put out a book on the problem with banks, with Timothy Sinclair, who's also here at work, in the World Authority on Credit Rating Agencies. It'll be in the Ramphil building.
It's the Ramphil building now, is it?
Yeah, the Ramphil building. We had to get a better spot because it's so important. So we had to have something. We had to have something that was suitable. So it's going to be the Ramphil building in the main theater, which is 0.21, and it will start at 6 and probably carry on to about 10 or so. There will be refreshments, so please come on by.
If you have any questions for Mr. Terrell here in the studio, or if you have any thoughts on what's been happening globally, nationally, locally, in the wake of the recession and the current crisis, then do feel free to get in contact, #Cyboric on Twitter or on Facebook, or you can pop a message in the chat room and we'll try and get back to you as soon as we can.
So how does this film, in the place of what's happening in the global economic crisis, actually affect students?
How does the film affect students?
Yeah, and how does then the economic crisis affect students as well?
Well, the economic crisis, I mean, affects all students. Definitely affects me personally, and I have student loans. The president talks a lot about that, President Obama, that is, and I'm always looking at the exchange rate when my loans come in, since I'm here at Warwick. So it definitely affects me. It's been kind of nice, actually, as the exchange rate has gone down with the dollar, but not so well for policymakers. I think it affects students because obviously I've seen a lot of university policymakers here, including high-level officials at the University of Warwick, who want to continue to raise tuition fees and emulate an American model of higher education. And while I think American educational institutions are some of the finest in the world and wonderful, they can afford to be that great because of their huge endowments. When it comes to students who come from a income class that is below average, such as myself, I fear for them and their place and their ability to advance themselves socially and professionally. So because of this, I think emulating American standard is probably not the best thing for Britain to do. And I think that's the way it affects students. As far as it relates to the whole crisis that's been going on, I think the only way to counter some of the damaging policies and the damaging sort of what Gillian Tutt in the documentary refers to as cognitive maps, that is what we are sort of taught to believe is the limit of our capacity in economic policy making and elsewhere. I think the only way to overcome that is through organized democratic revolt in a lot of ways. And I mean that universities should be a center of organization. They should be nodes. They're not just places to come and philosophize and wax lyrically and go and do this. No, they're not. They should be, and have always been, a center of organization, sort of nodes in the democratic structure of our societies. And they need to play that role. And that's why students need to see this documentary, so they see how important it is for them to take action and become part of this, as part of movements like Occupy.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think is prompting this drive towards a more American model of education?
Well, I think it's a budget problem here in the UK, as well as people being very unimaginative with policy. And I think that goes back to the sort of cognitive map and sort of putting limitations on ourselves as economic and public policy officials and saying, well, you know, how are we going to do this? Okay, well, we're going to look at how the Americans do it and maybe how the Chinese do it, but well, we don't really like how the Chinese do it, so we're going to do it the way Americans do it. There's not terribly much inventive capacity.
It's almost sort of Orientalism in a way.
well, maybe perhaps, but I don't think that they're thinking terribly hard about the effects that this will have on Britain 10, 20 years down the road.
Right.
I mean, as I said, I think the American system is a great one with some of its outcomes. It's a very, very expensive one. And I think that the UK can learn some things from the American model, but it should not rely on it, and it should not just embrace it without question.
So we were talking about the role of students and why it's important for the students to see this film. Do you think that universities then have a lot of power in these issues, or is it purely lying with the politicians?
Well, it's sort of, I don't know who watches Game of Thrones. I love Game of Thrones. But there was a great quote. There's a great quote in it, I think 2 episodes back. It basically said, power lies where people believe it resides. Okay. So I think that if universities want to take their proper role, to really embrace their proper role as these nodes of organization, then universities can have a great influence, fantastic influence. But if they would rather, they'd rather just be a business, which they have to be a little bit, but if they'd rather just be a business and be content with having, X amount of dollars and publishing X amount of papers, that's all well and good. But I think that university students are the blood of the institution, and they need to organize and take ownership of that institution, which I'm proud to say I think Warwick does fairly well. I've been very impressed by the student union so far that we've had here.
In what ways have you been impressed by the student union?
Well, coming from an institution that had almost no student activism, and someone who dissolved his own student union and then founded a new one because really couldn't do much with it, and getting students for the first time on faculty committees in like 20 years. I mean, it's quite organized. It's quite developed. It's not always at times maybe mature in the way it's developed. It's always evolving. But that's the nature of sort of young democracies, and a university should always be a young democracy. It's that best kind of laboratory democracy.
So, what's the relationship between the student and faculty at an American university? How do they see the students kind of function, as it were?
Well, I think it depends very much on the university. I mean, I really think that's something that's very intimate and personal to the kind of institution, and depending upon how big the institution is. I mean, I elected to go to a small university because I was able to nurture relationships with my professors. But typically undergrads can't do that at big, public, and very good universities just because of the numbers and the scale of the university. But I mean, I communicate with my professors, and I have relationships with them, and I know that they have kids now. I send them this, and I hang out. I babysit their kids sometimes. We have very close relationships, and I think that's very important. Any institution.
Could you just briefly summarise for our viewers why they should come and see this film?
Well, even if you don't have a background in economics, politics, it doesn't matter. If you want to understand what's been happening, why things aren't working, then come and see this film. Because it really shows you the limitations that have been placed on our imagination when it comes to what we can and cannot do. So please come, 6 o'clock this Wednesday in Ramfield, 0.21. And it's going to be a fantastic evening.
Thank you very much for coming in. Thank you.
And thank you to the viewers at home for watching this edition of Monday Live. We hope to see you next week, in fact, and indeed there'll be an edition of The Breakout on Wednesday, 8 o'clock. I won't be here because I'm be off watching Andrew's lovely film. But here in the studio there'll be The Activists, a new student activist group. And yes, that's an actual pun. The Activists. They specialise in drama-based activism, I would presume. And Warwick's very own knitting club will be around. They'll be popping into the studio for a chat. So that will be this Wednesday, 8 o'clock, right here on slive.co.uk. You can catch next week's edition of Monday Live, also 8 o'clock on slive.co.uk.
So we've got a very exciting few weeks coming up. Make sure that you check out that film on Wednesday. But that's all we've got time for now in the studio. So thank you to all of our guests, and good night. Have a really good evening.
Thank you. Good evening.